Welcome, everybody. Salamat datang. Welcome to the Asia School of Business, and welcome to this presentation of the World Bank Economic Update Report for East Asia and the Pacific. It's a real pleasure to host this and to host the World Bank. The report documents the East Asian countries' continued strong performance. This is the place to be. This region still powering ahead, but focuses on the policy distortions and the risks to the long-term performance. My name is Anela Monroe. I'm on the faculty here at the Asia School of Business. I'll be your chair for this morning's session. Can you hear me? Can you hear me on Zoom? Yep, okay. I'd just like to acknowledge Ozer Karagadikli. He organized this session. He was due to chair it, but he's out of the country. Ozer runs quite a vibrant central bank research center at the Asia School of Business. We hosted the World Bank Global Economic Projections in February, the IMF WEO in April, and the IMF Global Financial Stability Report. We'll host that on the 5th of December, so keep an eye out for that. There are also a lot of seminars going on. In February next year, we'll have some sessions on minimum wage, and we'll be hosting the Australia Macro Workshop in 2023 as well. So thank you for organizing, Ozer, and yeah, thanks for all the other events you do as well. So this morning, we'll spend the first 45 minutes or so. Dr. Aditya Mattu from the World Bank will present the report, and then we'll have a panel session with Professor Ye and Dinesh Cherian and myself to get the discussion going, and there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. So do jot down your questions as they come up. So first, let me introduce Aditya Mattu. Maybe you can unshare the screen, and Aditya, feels free to start sharing yours. Aditya is the chief economist for East Asia and the Pacific at the World Bank. His areas of specialization are trade development and international cooperation. He's published widely in those areas and also been widely cited in the mainstream financial press, The Economist, the Financial Times, and others. He was formerly economic counselor to the WTO. I know he's a regular visitor to Kuala Lumpur because I've been here for 3 years and I've seen him visit twice, once before COVID and once just earlier this year. So we have you remote today, but we know that you're often here among us. He has an MPhil in economics from Oxford and a PhD from Cambridge. So that must be awkward. I don't know who you cheer for in the famous boat race. But so welcome, Aditya, and let me turn over to you, and I look forward to hearing the report.
Thank you very much, Anela. Thank you to you and Ozer and the Asia School of Business. You've been remarkably valuable partners for us in many ventures, and I hope we can continue this partnership. I'm really grateful to you for hosting this event and also for persuading such thoughtful people to be discussants. In fact, to tell you the truth, I'm looking forward much more to hearing from all of you than from holding forth. But as you said, this is our regional economic update. It was recently launched, and it is particularly relevant to Malaysia, as I hope it will be evident. I hope in the next 40 minutes or so to present and make 4 key points. And the first, as you anticipated, is that Malaysia and the East Asia and Pacific region are growing faster with lower inflation than other regions of the world. But within the region, we see an important role reversal. China, which was leading recovery from COVID, has slowed down, while the rest of the region is seeing faster growth. The second key point is that it would be a mistake to be complacent because there are three serious impediments to growth. One is the deceleration of the global economy. Second is the financial tightening and what it means for debt. And finally, the very instruments that are being used to soften the pain today are creating distortions that could be an impediment to longer-term growth. And the third point follows is that better policies, more efficient social protection, and better intervention in food, fuel, and finance could both help deal with the difficulties today without sacrificing growth. And while there is much grim news, there is a silver lining. The crisis is creating new opportunities, but to take advantage of them, the region will have to implement other deeper reforms. Now, to begin with, let me focus on recent developments. And here, as you pointed out, on the horizontal axis, we have inflation. On the vertical axis, we have growth. To be higher here is a virtue, and to be lower on this axis is desirable. And as you see, many of the countries, including Malaysia, inhabit this northwest quadrant, which means higher growth and lower inflation. As I said, we are witnessing a role reversal. In China, which was growing remarkably fast in 2021 at over 8%, there has been a growth slowdown. Growth is 1/3 as it was. But in the rest of the region, we see a doubling of growth. In Malaysia, which grew at about 3% in 2021, is now growing at close to 6.5%. At the heart of this recovery is a bounce back in private consumption, as people have been liberated from the constraints of the pandemic. They're spending more. And as you see in Malaysia also, it's private consumption which has contributed significantly to growth. At the same time, export demand has remained resilient, and as factories have opened, there has also been relatively strong export growth. The third element is public consumption or government consumption, which has played a heterogeneous role. In some countries like Philippines, it's been more important. In other countries like Malaysia, less so. But the important thing to recognize, I should have also mentioned that once the COVID restrictions have relaxed, tourism is beginning to see a revival. So this growth bounce back in 2022 is based on a huge increase in private consumption, strong, persistent strength in exports, and the revival of services. Now, while this is happening in much of the region, you notice that in China, consumption remains a very small contributor. We now have the third quarter data, and it's a little bit better than the second quarter because we do see a positive contribution to consumption, to growth. We don't yet have the third quarter data for Malaysia. And I should say that the Malaysia Economic Monitor, which our hub in Kuala Lumpur produces, will soon be out and will present more recent evidence. Now, what about China? Now, as the rest of the world has been able to relax restrictions, which you see here in the blue line and yellow line, this is a measure of the restrictiveness of policy in terms of mobility, you see that China has persisted. Having largely shrugged off the more deadly Delta variant, it is struggling to contain the disease now in its most infectious manifestation, the Omicron variant. And a consequence of these shutdowns, which are necessitated by China's desire not to allow the spread of the disease, which I should say is it's important to understand why. And I would like hopefully to talk about it, because, there is a disconnect between the rest of the world, which sees it as a largely, excessive response, and China, which sees it as, or at least many in China, who see it as absolutely necessary. So I think it would be interesting to talk about that, because I think our failure to empathize with at least some of the thinking in China is a problem, because it makes conversations about policy more difficult. But one consequence of these restrictions, as you see, that during the Delta, China's production, sales, exports were chugging along quite nicely, but there has been a significant disruption during the Omicron crisis. Research that we're doing with my colleague Ergis Islamai, Daisuke and Zong reveals that while the crisis during the first alpha variant was acute and brief, here it is less acute but more prolonged in terms of its impact on output, sales of output of both services and goods. And that must not lead us to forget that China has seen perhaps the most remarkable recovery from COVID already. So despite this recent slowdown, China's output relative to pre-pandemic levels, which is 100 here, is still much higher than in most other countries. And the good news is that Malaysia now, with its relatively sustained recovery, also has its output well above pre-pandemic levels and well above the regional average and the global average. So in China's case, it is important to remember, if I can use an analogy from physics, this is now a bigger country, which is as much as 8–10% larger than it was before the pandemic, growing at a slower rate. So it's a bigger mass with a smaller velocity, but nevertheless, there is a high degree of economic momentum, and what happens in China will matter a lot for the rest of the world, and especially for countries like Malaysia, which are progressively more and more integrated with the Chinese economy, both in terms of reliance for inputs and as a destination for their exports. Let me now turn to what we see as the three big risks to growth. One is evident. The global economy is slowing down significantly. And for a region and for countries like Malaysia, which depend heavily on exports, that's bad news. We calculate that a 1 percentage point decline in the G7 economies and a similar decline in China could hurt GDP in Malaysia by much more than 1 percentage point. And Malaysia especially so among the large regional countries, because it depends so much more on its exports. And the bad news is that I said exports had been resilient, but the slowing down on growth, as you see, now is producing a deceleration, and in fact, even in a decline in exports in all countries, including Malaysia. The second big problem is that increasing interest rates are threatening capital outflows. And here you can compare the outflows that were associated with the COVID shock with the outflows that we are seeing subsequent to the war in Ukraine and Fed tightening. These outflows are provoking a depreciation in exchange rates, including, fortunately, to a less significant extent in Malaysia. But this double whammy of high interest rates and depreciating exchange rates is also increasing the burden of debt, especially in countries like Mongolia and Laos PDR, which have large amounts of borrowing at variable interest rates and denominated in foreign currencies. Now, even in Malaysia, debt is projected to increase somewhat. So this burden of debt will constrain public investment, and that is also likely to be bad for growth, because we have seen over the pandemic crisis and subsequently a generally downward trend in public investment. And this financial and fiscal tightening is going to make a revival even more difficult. So I talked about deceleration and debt as the two big risks, especially in a world which is slowing down and where financial markets are tightening. These are largely exogenous problems. The region did not create them, but is suffering the consequences. But how the region is responding to this crisis, especially the threat of inflation, which has been, the response has been remarkably successful purely in terms of the impact on inflation. If you look at this is an interesting mirror image. On the left, you see the propensity to use price controls. On the right, you see the extent of inflation. And you see it's the Middle East and the East Asian region which has used more price controls, which has also been relatively more successful in keeping prices low. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is these instruments create distortions. They do not create incentives for firms and people to respond to true scarcity. They also are costly because they're not well targeted. They benefit not just the poor, but almost everybody. And they are fiscally costly. And that contributes, as I said, to the problem of debt and leaves less resources for public investment. It's this class of distortions that I would now turn to, but also emphasize that these distortions sit on top of old, long-standing distortions in these economies. Some more in a few economies, but others almost across the board. So let me begin by making one general point, which is that when you look at these distortions today, for example, in Thailand and how Thailand is responding, it's one country for which we have better data. Thailand is using fuel subsidies. As much as about 11 billion baht is being spent on fuel subsidies. Now, since the poor also consume fuel and these subsidies are helping keep prices low, these subsidies are associated with a reduction in poverty of about 1 percentage point. These are simulations. These aren't actual measures. Now, Thailand, at the same time as providing fuel subsidies to keep prices low, is also providing direct transfers. These are only about 1/4 in value in terms of the total expenditure compared to fuel subsidies, but because they go directly to those who need them most, the poor, they lead to a reduction in poverty by almost another percentage point. Now, one experiment we did, which was to ask, suppose you took the money that's being spent on fuel subsidies and turned it into cash transfers, which were progressive and went to the poorest most, you could reduce poverty by 5 percentage points. Now, this creates a puzzle. Income transfers are clearly preferable to price regulation because they do not distort choices. They can be targeted to those most in need, and therefore they cost less. The question then is, why do governments still use fuel subsidies? Now, we could have stopped at the last slide and said, governments must use transfers. But I think a more interesting question is to understand why rational, sophisticated governments are using instruments that economists regard as less efficient. Now, what we did again was to look more closely at Thailand. Now, I mentioned cash transfers. Now, these cash transfers, what you see on the horizontal axis are the different income deciles. The poorest are in the 1, 2, 3 decile, and the richest are among the 8, 9, 10 deciles. Now, the cash transfers, if you get them, you're not supposed to get them if you're rich, but if you get them, everybody gets the same amount. When it comes to fuel subsidies, those benefit the rich more than the poor because the rich drive bigger cars for longer distances. Now, the interesting question is coverage. The cash transfers, this is coverage of cash transfers, is meant primarily for the poor. But what is striking is that even in a country like Thailand, which has relatively good infrastructure for delivering transfers, they have digital IDs, they have bank accounts, they have mobile telephone penetration. Even in a country like Thailand, these transfers reach only, and on the right axis, you see what proportion of population, only about half the population. And that coverage, as you would expect, falls quite dramatically. So, but the first point to recognize that even a government which has a social welfare function, which is concerned heavily about the poor, with the welfare of the poor, even that government might hesitate to use only cash transfers because fuel subsidies at least reach almost everybody, but cash transfers do not. Problem number one. Problem number two is that the coverage of transfers falls dramatically once you move beyond the very poor. So the middle class, let's say people in categories 4, 5, and 6, they feel significant pain from price increases, but only about a fifth of them would be eligible or manage to obtain transfers. So this then creates the political economy problem, that if the majority of the population is going to feel some benefits from fuel subsidies, but not any benefits from transfers, they're not really politically appealing. A third problem, of course, is related to recovery, that inflation also hurts firms because it shrinks the purchasing power of consumers and it increases their own cost of production. So to some extent, this price regulation is not just for social welfare, it's also a form of industrial policy to shield firms. And the final motive arises in countries where monetary authorities or central banks lack credibility or authority. Now, Olivier Blanchard made this very nice point, which is that we should think about even temporary shocks risking creating inflationary spiral, because today they increase prices, which could put pressure on workers to negotiate higher wages, and which in turn could induce firms to ask for higher prices and unleash a wage price spiral. What prevents that from happening to any significant extent is the belief that the central bank or the monetary authorities are going to prevent inflation. The notion of well-anchored inflationary expectations. But if that credibility is missing, perhaps because the central bank is not autonomous or deemed to be adequately competent, then the problem is that it is tempting to directly regulate prices to prevent inflationary expectations from becoming de-anchored and to keep inflation in check. Now, the point of this rather elaborate discussion is to make a more general observation that reform in one dimension, here the use of more efficient instruments to achieve soften pain and enhance growth, requires complementary reform, requires a stronger infrastructure for delivering social welfare, for perhaps extending welfare benefits, not just to the very poor, but a larger section of the population which is vulnerable. And it would still be progressive because it would be a much larger share of the incomes of the poor. And finally, creating greater credibility for monetary authorities and central banks to prevent inflationary expectations from being de-anchored. It's in those circumstances that we can make a stronger and more credible case for use of efficient instruments like transfers rather than price regulation. Now, having made this general point, let me turn to three specific areas: food, fuel, and finance. Now, the first striking thing that was a discovery for me, we all think about subsidies in the OECD countries in Europe and United States, but some Asian countries, Indonesia, Philippines, and China today provide more support to agriculture than OECD countries. Now, the problem with this support is that a lot of it takes the form of market price support and transfers primarily to rice, not more nutritious foods. So the consequence is that this support actually discourages diversified production at a time when consumption is becoming more diversified and consumers are turning more and more to fruits, vegetables, and sources of protein like meat. In fact, if you look at inflation today, in much of Southeast Asia, even though rice prices are stable, it's driven by an increase in the price of imported non-rice foods. So while you're getting a kind of calorie security by supporting rice, you're not getting nutrition security because you're leading to diversification or preventing diversification. Problem one, less so in Malaysia. But problem two is a lot of support goes to encourage input-intensive agriculture. Too much fertilizer, too much pesticide, and too much water. And that means that forget about greenhouse gases and global bads that come from agriculture. There are local bads in terms of the erosion of the quality of land and exhaustion of water supplies. So the policies in place are not even ultimately sustainable domestically. Now, that's why it is really important to change the notion of food security to more nutrition-based food security, to reduce subsidies and trade barriers that excessively favor rice, and to encourage more diversified production. And if there is a reason to support farmers, it takes ideally the form of decoupled income support of the kind the Europeans are using. And if there is a reason to support consumers, it takes the form of income support also in the way that I argued earlier. Finally, it's also necessary to shift support from input subsidies to encourage higher productivity and greater sustainability. Because today you have this tension. There are countries in Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, which have very high productivity, but ultimately very unsustainable agricultural practices. There are other countries like Lao PDR and Myanmar, which have relatively sustainable agricultural practices, but very low productivity. The challenge is to bend this arc of this trade-off and combine higher productivity with more sustainable methods. And there the problem is how low expenditure has been on research and development. I think in this respect, Malaysia might be an exception, but I'd like to hear very much from you. When it comes to fuel, Malaysia is not an exception. it has also seen, first, a significant effort in the last few years to reduce fuel subsidies, but during this crisis, an increase in fuel subsidies, which go, as is almost inevitable today, to fossil fuels and not to the cleanest sources. Now, one interesting piece of work that we were able to do for this update was to look at what is this crisis going to do to climate action, and what do we need to do. Now, the first piece of optimism, which you still see permeating some of the public pronouncements and literature, is that this big increase in the price of coal that we have seen, that is going to actually make green alternatives like wind and solar more attractive, so that there is more likely to be spontaneous investment in green and solar because fossil fuels prices have increased. Now, this conjecture misses out on the fact that when you use wind and solar, because they are intermittent sources of energy, the sun doesn't shine all the time, the wind doesn't blow all the time, you need backup energy sources. And the cleanest backup source is gas, and gas prices have increased significantly. There's another twist. Green energy sources like wind and solar require large upfront investments, and they're relative to coal more capital intensive. Therefore, the increase in interest rates that we are seeing is actually making them even less viable than before these price hikes that we saw. The problem for us today is that resorting to existing coal is a temptation that few governments will be able to resist in the current environment. But how can we prevent new investment in coal today, which will tomorrow become old investment and has two big risks? One, it would make it even harder to switch to green because of the sunk costs in coal. Or if green technologies improve dramatically, there is a risk that these investments in coal will become stranded assets, which has its own political economy problem, as you can see in a country like Indonesia. So the key recognition today is that you do need to find favorable finance for renewables, because that is what would, while acknowledging that old coal is almost incomparably competitive and inevitably competitive today, it would actually deter new investments in coal and fossil fuels and encourage investments in green technologies. That is, I think, the key thing to recognize. And a failure to recognize that, I think, condemns us to an even longer coal-based future. Turning now to finance, and I think it's important to see that in each case, it's a similar problem. In consumer subsidies, it is money going not just to the poor, but also to the well-off. In fuel subsidies, sorry. In agriculture, it's a problem of subsidies going not to nutritious foods, but primarily to rice. In financial sector, the problem is that, first of all, on the face of it, you don't have a huge problem. Countries seem to be, banks seem to be well capitalized, and these non-performing loans formally are at a very low level. The problem is you don't know what are the problems that lurk behind this veil of regulatory forbearance, which was introduced during the pandemic. That creates two risks. Risk number one, financial instability. Risk number two, misallocation of finance, because a lot of this finance can get stuck in zombie firms, which are not going to thrive in the future, but seem to need support today. So it's absolutely essential that we have greater transparency early in order to counter both these risks. Because here the problem is too much money going not to the most productive or the firms that are likely to thrive, but being devoted to keeping firms with a dim future alive today. Of course, how you sift between these firms, what kind of indicators could inform a more discerning policy, I think is a profoundly important question. And here again, I would hope very much to hear from you whether and how this could be done. So these were really the problems, the distortions that lurk and that need to be addressed. Let me turn briefly and finally to the opportunities that exist. And here, the two key developments which are important is first, the shifts in patterns of trade. And the second is the accelerated diffusion of technology. Some research we've done, in fact, with the our team in the East Asia and the Chief Economist's office in East Asia and the Pacific, based in Kuala Lumpur, with Shafat Yar Khan, who's, I hope, listening to this event, is that we are already seeing a shift in value chains. Now, this is a picture. You think of it as a controlled experiment. The one country which has imposed significant restrictions and tariffs on imports from China is the United States. So we look at the imports of final goods into the United States. And what do we see? That the share that comes from China has significantly declined. This is a slightly older chart. I should have shown you a more recent one. But by about 9 percentage points between early 2018 and towards the end of 2021. At the same time, US imports, the share of other East Asia and Pacific countries has steadily increased from about 10% to 15%. But there is a further twist. Even as East Asian countries step into China's shoes in the US market, they are importing more and more intermediate imports from China. So this is an interesting triangular trade that is developing, where China was selling a lot directly to the United States. Some of the inputs into what it was selling are now being diverted towards East Asia and becoming final good exports from the rest of East Asia towards the United States. So one interesting question is, who within East Asia is taking advantage of these opportunities? And here our work shows unambiguously and clearly that one country stands out, not just in the region, but globally, and that's Vietnam. Many other countries, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, relatively flat. Hardly any evidence of them taking advantage. Cambodia and Malaysia, a little bit. Again, not as striking as Vietnam, but somewhat. And this raises another really important question as to what are the determinants of the shifts we see today. Now, on the face of it, it would seem economics. That low wages, high productivity, so actual labor costs are relatively low. Better access to foreign markets through trade agreements. Less trade barriers at home which prevent inputs from coming in cheaply. But what we find is quite interesting. All these things matter. How similar your exports are to China matters. Those are the first two lines. You see how much the tariffs are matters. But what is really interesting and what is a new twist, that countries which voted similarly with the importer are more likely to see increases in exports. And countries that voted similarly with China are less likely to see increases in exports. So apart from this economic underpinnings and fundamentals, we are seeing an element of friend-shoring already in the shifts in patterns of production. And this creates a profound dilemma, especially for countries in East Asia and the Pacific, because economically, their integration with China has significantly deepened. But navigating politically these shifting sands and deciding how to make the most of opportunities without alienating political allies is going to be a profound challenge for these countries. One thing I should say about Malaysia, which is separate work, which I should have included if we were talking only about trade, is Malaysia is an unusual country in that its trade exposure, its participation in global value chains as a share of GDP has declined in recent years. I would be very interested to hear from all of you as to what is driving that phenomenon. Like a country like Vietnam sees both increases in the intensity of its participation in global value chains in terms of how much it imports to export, and also the scale of its participation in global value chains. Malaysia is seeing a reduction in its intensity in that more domestic value is being added, but a contraction in its scale, which means it's participating less as a share of its own GDP. What explains that? Let me turn finally to this other dimension of this current crisis, which is the transformation in services trade. Richard Baldwin used to speak about globotics, the fact that, the marriage of technology and services is going to transform the world. The pandemic has accelerated that trend. There are large investments, both by firms and consumers, in digital delivery. And once those investments are made, they are sunk costs. The marginal cost of trade with somebody within your country relative to that in another country, that home market advantage has virtually disappeared, which means you're going to see more and more increase in services trade. And even during the pandemic, while the rest of trade was shrinking, trade in these data-intensive services was growing. One problem for East Asia and Pacific is that while it has benefited enormously from openness to trade and investment in goods, it remains relatively suspicious of services, trade, and investment. On the horizontal axis, you have average tariffs on goods. On the vertical axis, you have a measure of services trade restrictiveness that we have created. And you'll see that much of Southeast Asia now inhabits, again, a northwest quadrant, which represents countries which are more open in goods, but more protected in services. The ability to take advantage of these new opportunities could be inhibited by the persistence of these restrictions. COVID has accelerated technology adoption. This is important work by my colleague Jonathan Timmis and others, which shows how much this has happened. Technologies like e-commerce are democratic. All firms have benefited. Sophisticated technology like data analytics have an elite bias. Large firms are taking advantage of them, then small firms are less able to do so. But again, to take advantage of this new proliferation of technology, it is important to have the skills. And here, Malaysia faces a big challenge. Inadequate workforce skills have been identified as some of the biggest problems that firms identify. And again, I'd like to talk to you more about what impedes the creation and retention of skills in Malaysia, and skills which will matter more in a world where technology, automation, digitization are becoming really transformative transforming the modes of production in both goods and services. And the final point is creating the infrastructure to take advantage of these new opportunities. And here you see Malaysia lies somewhere in between Southeast China and even Thailand, which have very high levels of penetration of broadband, and other parts of East Asia like Indonesia and Philippines, which are relatively backward in that respect. Creating the infrastructure for broadband is also conducive to more sophisticated participation in global value chains in both goods and services. Let me turn to the conclusion and say, look, we are passing through a difficult period. There have been powerful shocks to the global economy, first the pandemic, now war, and after that, inflation and financial tightening. These shocks, we estimate, could cut growth rates on average by as much as 0.5 percentage point. But how governments respond to these shocks also matters. If they respond through price regulation and other inefficient instruments, they will soften the pain for firms and consumers, but they will hurt growth even more because they will encourage a misallocation of resources, especially at a time, especially after the pandemic, where firms and consumers need better guidance through prices on how to allocate their resources. But if instead governments were to find more efficient instruments of intervention feasible through the kinds of reforms we've talked about, they could also soften the pain, but without as much of a growth cost. If they had the courage and ambition to implement even deeper reforms, that would boost both investment by leading to a better allocation, for example, of financial resources, and total factor productivity by improving allocation across sectors, across firms, and within firms. That is the story. Now I hope very much to hear from you about how plausible it is and what the holes are and how these are best filled. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for an extraordinarily interesting and useful analysis and discussion. So now we're going to shift to a panel discussion. Professor Ye and Dinesh, can I ask you to come and sit at the front? And we'll just take a minute to get the microphones sorted. Sorry, my chair is in the way. There's the so let me start by, I'll give you a minute to put on, maybe Hamid, could you help and make sure they're turned on? Thanks. So while you're doing that, let me just introduce our two panelists. We're three panelists. I'm the third one. So Professor Ye Kim Ling, he's professor of economics at Sunway University Business School. He's Director of Economic Studies at the Jeffrey Che Institute and Deputy President of the Malaysian Economic Association. So you have a pretty full portfolio. I hope you sleep sometimes. He's also formerly an external member of the Bank Negara Monetary Policy Committee. He has an MBA and a PhD from the University of Hawaii. And his area study that's probably most relevant for today is tax systems and structures and their effects on fiscal sustainability, growth, and income inequality. So note down your questions on those topics, but very relevant for today. Our second panelist is Dinesh Cherian, Director of Commercial Economics and Pre-Development at Hess Corporation, which is an American independent oil and gas company. He has 20 years of experience in oil and gas, including some years at Shell. Started out as an engineer and then received a Master of Science from LSE. So I'm going to ask Professor Ye to start 10 to 15 minutes, followed by Dinesh. I think we'll just go through the discussions and then we'll come back to you, Aditya, at the end, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A from the floor. So, and if you're on Zoom, please do use the Q&A and pop your questions in there. So I'll pass over to you, Professor Ye.
Let me first of all thank Asia Business School for this very kind and warm invitation to participate in this very important seminar that has, I think, laid down possibly the roadmap for recovery for Asia and also particularly for Malaysia. As we all know, the pandemic has taken a huge toll on the Malaysian economy, especially during the downturn in 2020. And as highlighted by Lydia just now, the recovery it's still fledgling in the sense that we are just, in the case of Malaysia, as pointed out in the report, that Malaysia just emerged from the downturn with the output gap probably closed by the end of 2021. I think that is broadly in line with our estimation. But nevertheless, we note that growth variation is also highly variable, especially both during the pandemic as well as in the post-pandemic recovery period, where we see a wide variation in terms of growth rate across the various industries. So the concern here is that, of course, those that are lagging in terms of recovery, they may not have fully rebuilt their balance sheet to the extent of withstanding a slowdown, as pointed out by Adia just now. So the concern for 2023 is very much on the minds of the regulators as well as policymakers as to the extent to which the Malaysian economy is sufficiently resilient from the recovery to withstand a kind of sharp slowdown, especially if there's a recession. And as estimated in the report, Adia has pointed out that combined downturn together with because of the high degree of openness of the Malaysian economy, the 1% drop could result in something like 1.5% decline in the Malaysian economic growth, output growth. You see, so that potential impact because of our high degree of openness is one of the key vulnerabilities that we face in the event of a global so-called a greater than expected or more severe global downturn. But nevertheless, the recovery in 2022 arising from what we call this some kind of revenge spending, especially on the domestic sectors that were closed before, that could possibly help to offset some of the so-called the domestic demand, offsetting some of the decline in the external, especially external or export demand. You see. But the concern here is that there are increasing number of vulnerabilities facing the Malaysian economy. Of course, from a consumption side, we do see households being stretched to the extent that they are, because of a high household debt level. That's one. And then, of course, the other concern about the fact that the shift towards higher consumption spending, in terms of the quality of growth, what we like to see is a greater emphasis on private investment. So in the case of Malaysia, the gross fixed capital formation has not really recovered fully, although it has perhaps close to the pre-pandemic level. But nevertheless, even before the pandemic, private investment level has generally been relatively lower than normal, what you call the average for perhaps the upper middle income countries. It's currently hovering around 16-17% of GDP, and we ideally if we can raise it to 20% of GDP, then we can see a more sustainable growth, especially from being led by private sector, and then importantly investment led. So that I think would help to sustain Malaysia's upgrading, and then importantly the structural so-called shift towards higher value goods and services. That would be in line with what you call the opportunities that have been highlighted earlier about leveraging on increasing trade, as well as technology diffusion to move up the value chain more quickly. And of course, we do face the kind of both the technological constraints and then importantly the so-called skills constraints as highlighted earlier. But importantly, what we find is that the need for Malaysia to undertake some fundamental reforms, which have been ongoing in terms of raising the level of indigenous technological capabilities, and then importantly, investing, pushing for highest expenditure in terms of R&D across both the government as well as private sector. So that would be the kind of long-term shift that are needed. And then, of course, we are mindful of the short-term risks that Aditya has highlighted earlier about policy distortions. Now, the distortions part, I think important to note here is that Malaysia, we have two positives going for it. One is in terms of being a so-called highly open economy. So we are able to, especially the recovery in the global economy, we are able to benefit much more than the other countries. But the other aspect is that the structural upgrading, what is missing here is that some of the so-called deindustrialization that has been happening since 2010, that we can trace back to the days when China joined WTO. We have seen a steady decline in Malaysia's export degree of openness. The export ratio has been declining since then. But more importantly, the decline, of course, Malaysia being part of it is as highlighted, as mentioned earlier about the fact that value chain Malaysia's participation has been, in a way, seems to be declining. Or one of the key reasons here is that the China +1 strategy of investments in the country, whereby the large-scale expansion of existing multinational investments, they have been relocated to places like India or Vietnam and all these countries. So we are, in a way, losing out in terms of the value chain upgrading and expansion in terms of scale of operations, whereby we are not seen as a place in terms of being able to have that kind of absorptive capacity for large-scale investments, because of, as mentioned, we have skill constraints. So that I think that affect Malaysia's growth in terms of achieving our potential growth, both in the medium to long term. But importantly, the other aspect here is that in the short-term horizon, the fact that the COVID stimulus, the public spending has now eased off, especially in 2022. The tapering off of this stimulus will likely lead to the need for, especially for support for the lower income groups. But importantly, the need, because of the constraints potential binding constraints because of the result of the diminishing fiscal space, we may see a need to actually reallocate resources rather than spending on investment and all that, but more towards social spending in the case of from a fiscal spending direction. You see. But what we see here is that in order to ensure growth can be sustained, we need to actually shift towards more private sector-led growth, and the emphasis here will be on how we can strengthen entrepreneurship, strengthen public investors' confidence, and of course, undertaking all the opportunities that have been mentioned by Adia about leveraging on the trade diversion from China. Importantly, how we can enhance the investment climate and have more targeted approach towards attracting some of these major companies that are relocating in the region. So that's one perspective. And then the other perspective is sort of from the government spending. We do see the need for fiscal consolidation, but as have been highlighted, we need to move to a more gradual approach of fiscal consolidation. But nevertheless, we still need to be mindful of the fiscal vulnerabilities, the shrinking fiscal space, to the extent that it can become a binding constraint on Malaysia's achieving its potential growth, given that government spending is quite sizable in the case of Malaysia, between 20 to 25% of GDP. So I think important for the government to also strengthen its spending efficiency, lower its, reduce its leakages and all that, and then importantly, looking for investments that have the greatest multiplier effect. Now, the increased spending efficiency through cash transfers, I think that's well noted. I think that's something that I think in the case of Malaysia, the challenge of gradually reducing the subsidy in the sense of ensuring that it's used more efficiently. I think the report has given quite a number of good, justifications. But at the same time, I think it's a public policy choice. And in the case of Malaysia, it's just unfortunate that we have an election cycle in sync with the economic cycle, to the extent that we cannot undertake that kind of hard reforms, or even reducing the subsidy slightly in order to achieve greater spending multiplier with better allocation of resources. So I think the misallocation of, especially on the fiscal side, is in the case of Malaysia, this is an opportunity that we should not miss, especially after the new government is installed. The next 5 years will have a more stable government that can undertake this kind of hard structural reforms. And we are hopeful that with those reforms kicking in, we may see a growth renaissance for Malaysia, largely because of rising investor confidence and the fact that East Asia region still remains the place for this China plus one strategy for a lot of companies. So I think with that, maybe I'll stop here. And
thank you very much for those useful comments. And I think you answered one of Aditya's questions, so that was good, but others could feel free to add to it. Dinesh, can I go on to you and then
Sure. Am I on? Is this working?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for having me at the Asia School of Business. It's great to meet with you. It's not loud enough. Is this better? Not really. Okay, I'll speak up. Once again, thank you for having me. Thank you for Ozair, who isn't here, who invited me to this. If you work in the oil and gas business these days, you don't get many invites to many places because you're not, you're not seen as the most favorable people on the planet. So it's always nice to be in things like this. I used to be an academic a long time ago. I used to get invited to many more things when I was an academic. So it's nice to be doing this again in a different guise. So I just want to say a little bit, my discussion will be much more tight and specific around the kind of area that we work in. So Hess Corporation, just for background, is an upstream independent oil and gas producer. And upstream, just specifically for those of you who are not familiar, the industry is divided into upstream, mid, and downstream. And upstream is really the front-end production of oil and gas from reservoirs. Midstream is some intermediate processing, and downstream is refining and turning it into fuel and fertilizer and all that kind of stuff. So we are exclusively in the upstream business. In Malaysia and in southern Thailand, where we operate, we gas producers. So we produce about 30% of Peninsular Malaysia gas and almost all of southern Thailand gas. So a lot of the electricity that comes is from gas that's coming off the fields that we operate in joint venture with Petronas. So there's a few things here that's of interest. I've watched the evolution of the gas pricing and the power sector in Malaysia over the last 10 years. I've been in and out of Malaysia, but over the last 10 years following it. It used to be a significantly more regulated pricing environment. In other words, as an upstream producer, we would sell our product to a buyer, and that we only have two buyers, which is Petronas and PTT, which is the Thai national oil company. They would then on-sell it to power producers or people like that for a substantially lower price than what is in the case now. So the big delta in what they would have to pay us in order to do that versus what they would pay would be a big gap, and that was a massive government subsidy. If you imagine Petronas or PTT, essentially an arm of the government, because those are both largely state-owned corporations. And the reason for that is, in essence, the upstream business is very costly. The desire to provide stable electricity and stable power for domestic consumption, industrial, drove that policy. What we have observed in the last 10 years or so is a gradual loosening of that. So in the aspiration here of reducing those subsidies, that has happened in these two countries to different degrees. And so the regulated pricing that is sold on onwards to consumers has gradually increased. That has pretty much brought that to sort of parity levels with the cost of supply. That has hit somewhat of a stop or pause through COVID. So COVID has been a bit of a reset for multiple facets of this. The two main things are pricing is no longer matching upstream costs. So there has been some brakes put on those just to help, as Professor Ye is saying, I think government policy to help firms get back up on their feet, to not let that flow through electricity pricing for domestic users and so forth. Those things are very seductive, and it's very difficult to unwind any kind of subsidy once you have it in place. So it's very easy to get used to this kind of thing. So from our perspective, we are somewhat agnostic because we only supply the upstream. But in the back of our minds, there's always this question of sustainability and how long this will go on for. So the longer the subsidy in place, it may be harder for it to keep going. So we are mindful of that aspect. One aspect that hasn't quite taken off, despite many years of trying for liberalization in Malaysia in the energy space, is third-party access into Malaysia. So largely regulated or controlled. And so third parties selling gas directly integrated to end users has not happened, despite in principle, in theory, being available. And it's hard to exactly know what that is, but it's definitely an area that should be focused on if we truly want to liberalize this market. The sense is that the incumbents are just incredibly powerful. So whoever owns the grid and whoever owns the power generating capacity have a lot of say in how this happens. So that has been a limiting aspect. But by and large, in our space on the gas front, there has been a steady trend towards liberalization, which has paused recently for COVID-related reasons, but has largely, I would say, been successful in ensuring the price signal is getting to the final. So that has been a plus. One aspect that I do want to talk about, and actually it's interesting in Aditya's slides on the comparison of, say, solar and coal, that financing cost is proving to be a problem. What I did see on that slide is either explicit or implicit charge on emissions, which as a business, we do now as default, that every investment proposal we consider, we layer on a emissions charge onto that proposal for any investment that we go forward to then say.
I'm very sorry to interrupt, Dinesh. I'm finding it very hard to hear what you're saying, and I'm equally interested in hearing what you're saying.
Should I use this?
Yeah. Much better, much better. Oh, thank you.
So Aditya, one thing I was saying was on the sort of broader sustainability front, clearly we are a fossil fuel producer and we emit carbon dioxide, both in the production, but of course in the final consumption of the product. And one thing in your slides, which interested me when you were comparing the solar versus the CO2, the coal generation and cost, one of the big factors was the cost of financing and how that was potentially dissuading the move towards greener technologies. What was missing in that, and maybe it's there and I didn't quite get it, is the either implicit or explicit charge that would be imposed on carbon emissions that then changes that equation. And so from firsthand experience, when I was in my previous role, we drafted the policy internally to impose carbon charges on any of our emissions. So whenever we evaluate any projects that we do now, we will compare the emissions from a particular investment decision versus another one. And all things being equal, obviously the worst, the higher CO2 emitting investment option will lose and will not receive funding. And so in that chart of solar versus coal, it would seem to me that the CO2 future charge potentially could swing that balance. And so one of the challenges we have being a US-based corporation, we're much more sensitized to this than maybe businesses and governments in Asia. But what I see as a trend across companies like us and other businesses like us, particularly those that are based in the West or the US or in particularly Europe, your investment may be on the other side of the planet in a country that may not care as much about CO2, but the corporate requirements or the corporate expectation for sustainability is trumping that. We won't do that because it's going to emit too much CO2, or we would need to do something radically different in order to do these project A or project B, despite the fact that local regulation may not require any of that. And we are starting to see the shoots of that. I know in Indonesia on power plants now, there is a carbon charge on emissions. It's small, but it's a signal that even in a country like Indonesia, this is already being considered seriously. Bursa is now looking at carbon offsets, voluntary carbon offsets, but all of this is gaining traction. Singapore already has a firm CO2 emissions charge. So on our side, that's become a big deal now. And actually, it's a big deal in even having the conversations with governments, because you're actually sometimes maybe not on the same wavelength. But it is happening, and it will happen. I think that train is moving in one direction. It's just the pace of it. So I think that equation can change quite materially in terms of whether solar will become more attractive. And so gas, in the grand scheme of things, if you have a scale of the dirtiness of fuel, coal is generally considered the worst. Gas is your bridging fuel, and then you have your renewables. And so our aspiration, and this is why we're big advocates internationally on some kind of carbon pricing, is that this stuff is reflected, the cost of that is now reflected in even different fossil fuels. So, in order to advance the gas cause, as it were, having carbon reflected on coal versus on gas, we'll see a shift in that scenario. So what many people don't know, in the year 2000, for example, gas generation for electricity in Malaysia was about 70%. Today, it's about 30 to 40. And that has happened largely because coal is cheap. And so, but despite the fact that it emits a much greater level of CO2 than, say, gas would do. So I think that equation that he was showing should flip, or can flip, with the carbon costs attached to it. We are advocates of that in some fashion. I think that's all I want to say. That's kind of my space. I don't really feel like I need or want to go into space that I'm not as familiar with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And how encouraging to see the industry leading the way, at least in anticipation of future carbon charges, to be factoring them in. Thanks. Hamid, can I get you to put a detail on the screen up the front, if you could, then we can see together. So thank you. I'm just going to add a few comments, and then I'll come back to you, Aditya, and then we'll have Q&A. So yeah, I enjoyed the report. My main takeaway is it is growth in this part of the world is still extraordinary. It may not be what it was 10 years ago, but it's still extraordinary. And I do think these decades of strong growth have made this region really an exciting place to be, and somewhere that with decades of positive change is very open to change and open to the future. And I think that's a nice effect of that growth. But then the report is really about, getting things right. And if I were to paraphrase it in a big picture, it would be, don't be complacent and keep on a sustainable path. So to me, I think three things stood out, and I'm going to comment on one and follow each one with a question for you, Aditya. So one thing that really stood out for me was the surge in the cost of subsidies in Indonesia and Malaysia. And that's clearly a risk to sort of long-term fiscal sustainability. And seeing Malaysia in the sort of longer-term view, in the mid-80s, Malaysia had quite a big government debt to GDP, over 100%, I think. And then there was a remarkable decline in that debt pre-Asian crisis. You can pay out, you can get your debt to GDP down in three main ways. One, you can pay it off, and I'm sure it was being paid off. And the other, that's the numerator, and the denominator, you can grow or you can inflate away your debt. And Malaysia then was growing at 9 or 10% plus a small contribution of inflation. So it's relatively easy to get that debt down with that kind of growth. And I think that's probably something of the past. And since the Asian crisis, each crisis, the debt to GDP ratio is sort of ratcheted up a few percent. And so now we're at about 60%. That looks pretty good compared to a lot of countries, but we're not looking at the lowest common denominator. That's not probably the place that Malaysia wants to be. So now still, 4 to 4.5% growth. So there's still that scope, but now is probably the time to think seriously about that and really to keep that fiscal space. And it's been great to have that fiscal space during COVID. And going back to these subsidies, I really take the point of, blanket subsidies are not a good idea. They're regressive. We'd rather have cash transfers, but it is extraordinarily difficult to achieve, both in being able to effectively target and the political economy, and you mentioned the industrial policy component with inflation. And so my question is, can I think you've put in place the principles, but are there really successful examples? Mostly we hear about subsidies being removed in countries in distress with World Bank and IMF programs coming in as part of the fiscal retrenchment. But the happier story is to do it in good times. And what are the examples? You mentioned Europe, but some decades ago, we had Europe with mountains of butter and things. So there's been a transition there. And what are the other success stories to look to? And I guess just another point about Malaysia and these subsidies is Malaysia is an upper middle income country. It's really right almost at the top of the upper middle income band. So Malaysia is on the cusp of being an advanced country. So there are a lot of people who really, really don't need these subsidies in Malaysia now. Targeted to that is a theme you have of improving social support. And I wonder if you could talk more about that, sort of that transition from subsidies to targeted payments and ultimately to more durable social support programs. I know Malaysia's done a lot in terms of putting in place unemployment insurance programs and so on in the last few years. So really, what are the priorities in that area? Is that something you could talk to? And my final comment is, in some of the charts, in quite a number of the charts, actually, I noticed Malaysia's not there. Whether that's Malaysia's different and not relevant to the topic you're looking at, or is there an issue with data in Malaysia that sometimes it's not available? I've been here for about 3 years, and I'm sure there's a culture and a skill set that should be really good at data collection. So I wonder if availability is an issue, and to be a little bit provocative, is that an area where the World Bank could help Malaysia and work with Malaysia to improve potential data gaps? So I think I'll leave it there, and I'll go back to you first, Aditya, and then open to the floor. If you're on Zoom, please put your questions in the Q&A, and then so I'll pass to you first.
Thank you very much, Anela, for these thoughtful questions. I really appreciate the very insightful remarks by Professor Ye and from Dinesh Cherian. I'm learning a lot. This was the biggest incentive for me to be here. And, for every question, I want to turn around and ask you some questions. But let me begin by just trying to give you a few more precise responses to the questions that you've posed. So the first question, are there successful examples of reducing fuel subsidies? I think one thing that I did want to say is, instead of just a naive prescription, we did try hard to understand what are the complementary reforms that are necessary to implement efficient policies. It's something that my institution and all of us are not always good at doing, which is understanding why, seemingly sensible policies are not implemented. But there are occasions, I have from India, and here there was a very interesting reform of cooking gas subsidies. In fact, the government introduced a system of income transfers, which was more or less across the board, with some degree of voluntary opting out, with some kind of social nudge that if you don't really need it, don't claim it. But that allowed the liberalization of the gas price. Now, in the Philippines, there are important examples. I think Philippines has relied much more on transfers for food. I'm less sure about the fuel component rather than trying to regulate prices. And Philippines is a country. In Jordan, there is an interesting story also. I think it is Jordan. I hope I'm not getting it wrong, of pre-committing, because one of the big issues with these subsidies are that, one, they don't reach politically important groups and vocal urban middle class, and that making those compromises, which mean to extend benefits where they're not strictly needed, at least in a transition to more efficient instruments, seems to be one challenge. The other is credibly committing to delivering this support. I think in many political economy problems in economics, we argue very strongly, whether it's trade liberalization or distortions of prices, that if you eliminate those distortions, the cake will expand. Now, if the cake is going to expand, it should in principle be always possible to tax the winners to compensate the losers. So that, I think, is an interesting diagnostic way of posing the question. If you're so sure that the cake is going to grow, then why is it that you're not able to implement these Pareto improving policies? And I think part of the problem is lack of credibility, that it's possible in principle, but in practice, governments don't do that. So sometimes I think the Jordan example is of a government first making the transfer, demonstrating the credibility of its intentions, and then phasing out the distortionary policy. So that's one question. Your second question was, are there examples of improving social support priorities? Again, I should say two things. One about government debt. The observations you made, Anel, are very interesting. My colleagues, Ergis Islamai, Augustine Samano, who's actually based in Kuala Lumpur, and I are working on trying to understand precisely, and they are going to put out a policy brief, which will come out very soon, which talks precisely to this whole point of how do you deal with debt. And, do you grow out of it as you've done in the past? Do you inflate it away in a way that creates other big distortions in the economy? Do you practice some forms of financial repression, which fortunately isn't a big issue yet in this region? Or do you do more meaningful resource mobilization? So that's, again, if I would like to ask Professor Ye that question, that even though, Malaysia has been spending quite a lot, it is still a relatively low tax, low revenue jurisdiction. Has growing rich changed its a view of the state? That is, it more willing to countenance a bigger state which redistributes and stabilizes in a way that it has not in the past? And you see, that also is relevant for Anela's debt question. Do we see a change in the political economy of taxation in a way that the state is going to deal with debt by mobilizing more resources? I think that's one question I have, which follows from some of your observations. But then turning to your social protection, again, there is really important work happening in the bank. Some of our previous updates dealt with it. My colleague Andy Mason has been working with Tobias Futse, who's also based in the Kuala Lumpur hub. And on this question of what is referred to as adaptive social protection, which is based on having the infrastructure, which is digital IDs and real-time data, which enables you to target people in response to shocks and to have information on who really needs it and who needs it. So the system is durable, but the support is not durable. It doesn't create poverty traps. It is very sensitive, and it has mechanisms which direct support in response to specific shocks to need them. But you need a very heavy infrastructure in terms of data, in terms of observation. And here, to be blunt, I think a concern is that when we have benign, benevolent governments and there is shared trust, then these data systems are easy to create. When people are suspicious of the government, they're less willing to invest in the creation of the kind of data systems which facilitate efficient transfers, because there is a risk of abuse. So how we deal with those problems is going to be really important. And the third issue that you raised was data. And we've talked about this, and we are actually working on it. In fact, I'll take this opportunity to ask my colleague Tobias Futse, who is supposed to send you a letter based on a note that we have prepared, and we would like to work with you and other institutions in Malaysia, including Suntec and other universities. And we, I was there and we all talked about it. I think Malaysia, there is less public access to data. It's quite striking when you look at Indonesia, what kinds of research have been possible with, for example, longitudinal data on households, which has helped us to understand much better what works and what doesn't. And so one of the points of this note, a draft of which I would love to share with Professor Ye, and if Dinesh wants to revive his academic career, is to see that demonstrating what are the interesting policy questions we could illuminate if there was better access to data. Sometimes, data is disclosed as to the bank, and we are very grateful for the relationship we have with the Malaysian government because it has made possible some good research. But I think we are talking about general data transparency rather than the more demanding challenges. And I should say one big issue is being able to link different data sets. For example, when we are working on trade, if we can link customs trade data to firm level data, you develop a much better understanding, for example, as Professor Ye was talking about this deindustrialization. Why is it happening? What is happening? Similarly, being able to merge different household related data sets, micro data sets, would give us much deeper insight on the social protection questions that you're talking about. So I would like very much to work with all of you as we have initiated, and hopefully if you haven't already received this letter, you'll receive it soon. So we try and develop a story of what could be done with better data. I just wanted to quickly say one more thing in response to what Dinesh said. I think you're absolutely right that one thing that is missing from that is either an actual carbon tax or a rationally expected carbon tax. The reason that we didn't do that is because, as you also pointed out, that this is an environment where, in fact, even fuel subsidies that had been phased out are being reintroduced. So the political economy of a carbon tax, and when you said you're a US-based company, the US with its supposed Inflation Reduction Act has just turned the whole logic on its head. Instead of going the route that economists were harping about, and you were with a good conscience building into your projections, a carbon tax, it has thrown a carbon tax out of the window and introduced huge green subsidies into the story. So that is an interesting question now, that how do you see these huge subsidies, which in a way also might be what made it possible for cheap Chinese solar panels to facilitate a switch to solar in the past. And, people said this is industrial policy, but it was also the only climate policy in town. And now some people say, but the US is combining these subsidies with protection, local content requirements, favoring US-based production. I think I worked in the World Trade Organization. I'm a very pro-open trade. But I think we also should not be politically naive. If we really believe we are in the middle of an existential crisis, and if we see that this carbon tax remains elusive, then even the perverse industrial policy motivated subsidies might be the only way that we can get the world to do something, by harnessing the industrial policy motive for the greater good of climate change. But I'm curious, Dinesh, how do you see the Inflation Reduction Act? And do you really see a prospect of a carbon tax? And how do you change your view of the world and the choices that you're making based on this? Because in principle, you know, they are similar in their effect, but the political economy of a tax and a subsidy is very different. One inflicts pain to induce you to switch. It sticks. The other is carrots. And that means that you switch when it becomes profitable for you to switch. So how should we think about the whole climate challenge? You know, I have lots of questions, but I should stop now and hear all of you. And I'm really enjoying this. Thank you.
Dinesh, I'll pass that one to you.
Yeah, so it is an incredibly interesting time, and all this is really very fresh, this big change in the thinking. I think the way we see it, and when I say we, I'm talking very specifically about what we as a corporation do, and then our nearby peers who we interact with. The overarching logic remains that we feel, and it's predicated a little bit on what we are seeing real time in the European situation, where there is either a tax or some kind of cap on carbon emissions, which then impose some kind of additional cost on emitting carbon. So whether that's a tax or a cap or something that is going to add an additional load. Our thinking is that so long as we remain primarily in the business of extracting and producing a hydrocarbon fuel, we should expect some kind of additional cost on emitting that carbon. To your question, Aditya, on, you know, there's a carrot on the other side, you as a corporation may then feel, actually, it's worth my while to diversify away from fossil fuels into some kind of renewable energy business. And we see big, I used to work for Shell before, and you see Shell making quite a substantial transition into renewables, out with of even these incentives, but even more so maybe with these incentives. So it's a sort of, if you stay in the oil, any kind of fossil fuel business, the expectation of having some kind of additional charge is our baseline view. If you don't want to play in that space and there's incentive enough for you to move into a different space, then you can leave that problem behind. But so long as you choose to remain in this space, I think our feeling is, at least for now, having given this is all fairly new, our thinking for now is that the likely outcome is that there will be some kind of additional cost of doing that business.
So maybe I can come back. Did you want to follow up on anything?
Perhaps I can respond to the need for Malaysia to enhance its resource mobilization. And this is where, in terms of the tax to GDP ratio, it has been declining since the past couple of decades, to the extent that now it's only hovering between 11 to 12% of GDP. The challenge now is that our current revenue level is just adequate to cover just about the operating expenditure. So that's where the subsidies of estimated about 80 billion this year is almost equivalent to our development budget for 2022. See? So there's a need for Malaysia on the revenue side to actually enhance, especially to diversify its narrow tax base. And of course, we had our value added or GST tax before, and then because for political reasons, it was ditched, and then we reverted back to the sales and service tax, which actually collected probably about less than half of what potentially consumption-based tax like GST could mobilize, you see. So that's one direction that I think whoever the new government will have to look at it more seriously in terms of widening the tax base, and then of course explore other tax tools. You see, for example, some kind of capital gains tax or even carbon tax will be likely to be on the table, especially if you can convince the public of the necessity that you can enhance public spending efficiency on the one hand, and you can get better value for paying your taxes. Then the other aspect about consumer behavior regarding subsidies, we know it's superior in terms of cash transfer, but from a political angle, we were told by politicians, so-called politicians, public policymakers, that consumers actually prefer that we are able to earmark the subsidy with the item concerned, because consumers have this, they link their support of for the government in terms of what actions have been taken by the government to address very, very specific items like chicken prices, egg prices, fuel prices. So if you don't associate that and you just give a lump sum transfer, apparently the public do not seem to attach that great importance to the action of the government. So that's one consumer behavior I think we need to change in order to demonstrate that cash transfer is actually more superior, but that depends on how they allocate their spending at the individual household level. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, interesting point. And yeah, the point on the revenue side is very well taken, because that's declining revenue take over time. It's not, and I guess most countries have moved to, well, a lot of countries have moved to the GST approach, and correct. So yeah. So let me go back to there's a little bit of a mixed message for me here. So Malaysia has declined in its share of global value chains, but Malaysia is also still extraordinarily sensitive to falls in G7 growth. And so is it good that Malaysia is less integrated in those value chains because maybe the export share left an exposure? And so it's a bit more domestic demand a good thing? That's a kind of a difficult, where do you fall on on that trade-off, right? And so you mentioned that since China entered the WTO, Malaysia's export share maybe has fallen, but still in your graph, Malaysia is the most sensitive to a fall in foreign demand, the G7. So should I see this as a good thing or a bad thing, or I should think it's all right because it's got a flip side?
Is this a question for me?
Yes, I'm going to challenge you on that one, because there's sort of a little bit of a mixed message in there.
No, I think it's a good question, and it shows the tension between macroeconomics and microeconomics. Because, you know, when you look at a country like, let's compare Malaysia and Indonesia, for example, or Malaysia and Vietnam on one side, and say Indonesia and India on the other side. You know, Malaysia and Vietnam have really successfully participated in global value chains. But the level of participation is not as sophisticated as Professor Ye said, as you would want it to be. Vietnam is the second biggest exporter of mobile phones, but most of the sophisticated inputs come from outside, from Korea and other countries. But the scale of their exports is so large that there's been transformative in terms of development. I think the same is true of Malaysia. It's really successfully diversified to a large extent away from its dependence on natural resources. But when you look at the exports, you look at the four HS4-digit categories, the 5 things that Malaysia imports are integrated circuits. The 5 biggest exports are integrated circuits. So it's again very specific. And the interesting question is, what do the Malaysians do when those products pass through the country? So I think the important thing to recognize is that process of participation, specialization in global value chains is conducive to, first of all, really focusing on things that you're good at, a kind of hyper specialization. You can think of it as Adam Smith on steroids. But it's also in the context of relationships, whether it's explicit relationships within a multinational or implicit relationships because of repeated interactions, say, between Foxconn and Apple. It also leads to sharing of technology. And those changes are really what ultimately drives growth, the diffusion of technology and specialization and so on. But it is also true that when you become integrated in the world, you become vulnerable to disruptions in supply. If there is a pandemic in China, you're going to suffer in a way that you wouldn't if you produced everything at home. And similarly, when you depend on the global market, you're vulnerable to shocks in the global market. So on balance, what would you rather do? Would you rather be India, which has missed out on this whole phenomenon and has, chugged along at a lower rate of growth, but seen periods of acceleration when it liberalized and been less vulnerable to global shocks? And so is Indonesia, for that matter. So I think the trade-off here is a little bit the question that you're talking about, the fiscal and the social protection question, that how does the state mediate between harnessing the gains from economic efficiency and openness and trade and preventing the instability that comes from greater vulnerability to global shocks, or even the inequality that can come from, globalization. I think that is the role that you would expect the state to play in East Asia, where there are small open economies. The puzzle is it does not. It has largely refrained from either doing a lot of stabilization or redistribution. And, I don't know the answer to this question. And one question is, does with growth and increasing incomes, does the nature of the state change? And also, I think the taxation question that we've been thinking about, the globalized world makes it very hard to have progressive income taxation. Capital runs away to other jurisdictions, rich people move out. So perhaps, let me say something a little bit radical. When you look, there's very important work my colleague Matt Waipoy and others have done, which show what do these combination of taxes and transfers do to inequality in Southeast Asia. And the interesting thing is they do nothing to inequality. Or sometimes make it worse. And sometimes, so the whole point is that you're not really, there's very little that is progressive in your tax and transfer system. So what about the idea that you say that, look, we are going to have indirect taxes for what is domestic, and we'll also import destination-based taxes on everything we import. We will forget about pretending to be progressive on taxation because it's hard to do. But what we'll do is have an efficient system of progressive transfers and efficient public goods. So progressivity will come, and I think that might be the radical rethink we need to think. That's what this adaptive social protection I mentioned. That's what this inequalities in the quality of education, the inequality. Malaysia has 90% coverage of preschool education, but big inequality in the quality of that education. Similarly in health. So thinking about how we change our conception of what it means to stabilize incomes or consumption is, I think, one of the big questions in terms of understanding the nature of the state or also the nature of the society and economy in Southeast Asia. So I'm hiding behind grand statements, but I think you're asking a very important question.
I think your answer is, if I think about buying bonds or equities in the long run, you buy equities, but it's more risky in the short run. But the long run is clear, you want the growth. And so then the state plays a bigger role to manage the risk. And do you want to add anything to that? It's more your area, Professor Ye.
The other interesting development is that most of Asian countries, their financial system is what they call bank-backed. So they are not so amenable or so what they call encouraging, especially for startups, entrepreneurial activities. We need more private equity and venture capital funding, that kind of risk capital that will allow that kind of emerging technologies to be financed. So I think on one hand, the traditional financing is good for stable, what they call sustainable development projects and all that. But on the other hand, if you want to encourage greater innovations and technological development, we need to create that ecosystem for startups and venture capital and private equity. So that, I think, in the case of Malaysia, we may be lacking in that. It's not big enough to spur the large scale, technological innovation that we are seeking.
Does that go back to your question, Aditya, about is Malaysia an exception in R&D productivity? I think you were talking more about agriculture in your comment, but
I think there's a very important other report that I think I might have mentioned it, by Andrew Mason, called the Innovation Imperative in Southeast Asia. And it looks particularly closely at Malaysia. And I think one of the big issues in Malaysia, like other Southeast Asian countries, is the heterogeneity. There are some firms which are close to the cutting edge. Perhaps Dinesh's firm is one of those. But there are lots of firms which inhabit the relatively less efficient interior. And I think this whole question of access to finance that Professor Ye is talking about, I think these are the kind of challenges of how do you encourage diffusion of technology. And here the creation and retention of skills and access to finance are probably ensuring more equal access to finance, I think are profoundly important questions. And my final point on this is that services are relatively less open and competitive in Malaysia. And access to business services also empowers both the small firm, and access to services also is crucial for household welfare. So these are other dimensions of the unfinished reform agenda and the otherwise remarkable story of Malaysia.
Are there questions from the floor? Yep.
Hi, this is Shafat Khan. I'm from the World Bank, and I have been working a little bit with Aditya on these issues. Your question, Ella, about how to reconcile, I just have a little bit of answer, unless I'm misunderstanding the question. So I think it's very much in line with what you would expect. If you are retreating from value chains and you are trying to export more of your value added in each amount of your export, then you would see that you're more vulnerable to global conditions, because then your own domestic value added is a bigger proportion of foreign imports or for your exports. So then if those exports are affected because of global conditions, you would expect your own value added to be more at stake at that point. So Vietnam, on the other hand, which is importing more to export more, is deeper has a deeper entrenchment in value chains would be less vulnerable, as we would expect, because it's gaining all these benefits from global participation, like learning from other countries, technology transfers, as well as higher quality of inputs and other things, but also is less vulnerable. Its own value added is less vulnerable. And then because there's more inflow and outflow of goods from Vietnam, it's getting all the benefits of that, less vulnerable to global conditions, but also is at scale, generally is growing in overall participation. So I think that's my way of reconciling these. But other thing is what you import and export, in my understanding, matters a lot more as well. Because Malaysia, as we look at it, it's on the tech side, technology side, it's more durables. And then on the natural side, in energy side, it's again petroleum and other products. Both of these are very vulnerable to global conditions. That's my takeaway. It's not a question exactly, but just a comment on your question. I hope that this helps in some sense.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting sort of nuance to it. Thank you. Other questions from the floor? Yeah, Oscar?
Hi, thank you. Thank you for this talk. My question is, I've also been working on as part of Action Learning program in Vietnam on a value chain with the bank. We are basically advising this bank to finance value chains in 3 industries: pharmaceutical, FMCG, and oil and gas. So my question is, again, when I look at the diagram for what Aditya showed, the Vietnam, and I'm doing a study in the pharmaceutical industry. And so the key ingredients, basically, I figured out were the way to promote pharmaceutical industry in Vietnam is to promote agriculture, because the generic APIs, I mean, the APIs is a term. Basically, you basically need things like cardamom in your country to manufacture medicine. And then you probably make investments in the value chain and sort of like grow this pie and the cake that Alta is talking about. So my question is, how do countries, or how do a company can identify, or like an investor can identify industries in order to grow themselves in a particular geographic environment? Thank you.
Aditya, do you want to take that one, or anybody else? Yeah, I think it's quite a difficult one to getting really to the sub-industry level of inputs into, but it connects agriculture to pharmaceuticals, yeah, which is possibly a little bit micro for your area.
No, I think it's a very good question. I should ask Shafat to answer this question. But coming back to, I think you're absolutely right. You know, this pharmaceutical value chain is fascinating, that a lot of these APIs now actually originate in China. It's really striking that a country like India has become more specialized in formulations, and how far this is linked to, you know, having local agricultural production is an interesting question, because, you know, a lot of African countries, for example, or countries in South America, their big concern is that their agricultural production has not equipped them to move to this more basic manufacturing stage. So there, it's more you have productive agriculture, but you haven't really been able to step into even the most basic manufacturing value chains like pharmaceuticals. But I don't know enough about it. You know, there is about the pharmaceutical value chain, except to see that this shift and towards APIs, where China has become increasingly dominant, and in a country like India, the specialization more downstream in formulations. But it'd be interesting to think about it. I think the point Shafat made is a very good point, and it, I think, is a very good micro point about how, you know, technology diffusion and, you know, Samsung's presence in Vietnam. But at the aggregate macroeconomic level, you know, whether you have limited exports and a higher share of domestic value added in them, or whether you have small share of value added in a huge share of exports, the aggregate exposure, I think it is an interesting question. Is it really very different? Though the microeconomic benefits, I think, as Shafat rightly pointed out, might be greater. But both countries have not, Vietnam has made remarkable progression relative to, say, a country like Cambodia or Bangladesh. But it is also at it's like Malaysia 20 years ago. Both are in a way stagnating now in their participation in value chains, and both are struggling with this next step to greater sophistication. And I think in both cases, it's a little bit, we can call it a value chain or a trade trap, where the incentives to acquire skills are also a function of what you're specialized in. And you need some kind of exogenous kick to break out of this. And that exogenous kick, for example, came in Korea by huge investments in higher education before there was demand for those skills. And that's also happening to some extent in China, where you have this big improvement in tertiary education. In a way, it's almost premature because the structure of downstream industries is not necessarily absorbing those people. In Malaysia, the big risk is that that kind of investment in higher education might lead to emigration unless you have the kind of domestic opportunities, whether it's access to finance or access to other types of opportunities, which helps Malaysia to retain those skills. So in a general equilibrium sense, understanding the links between incentives to acquire skills and the structure of your comparative advantage is something I think we all need to understand better, and how you break out of low-level equilibrium traps and whether technology can play a role in that as well.
Thank you very much. I think we've probably run out of time, so I'm going to wrap up by extending a huge thank you to Aditya and also to Professor Ye and to Dinesh. It's really, it's a pleasure to be here in person after the pandemic. And although we could do it before, it's now so easy to have people from across the world in a setting like this. So we're back and we're better. And I appreciate the final comment on higher education being one of the new providers in Malaysia as well. So thank you again for an extraordinarily interesting talk about really important issues for Malaysia at this stage. And again, thank you to the panelists. So please join me in thanking.
Thank you very much, Anela and Ozair, and thanks all to the panelists. Very knowledgeable, and thank you for my colleagues for turning up and boosting the audience. Thank you. Stay well. Bye-bye.